power does not announce its limits. It grows. Quietly at first, almost unnoticed. A small shift in thinking. A different way of approaching the same problem. A decision that seems minor at the time. And then, over time, those small differences begin to compound. Until what once looked ordinary becomes something entirely new. That is where this story begins. Not with dominance, not with control, but with observation. Because before power is built, it is understood. And before it is understood, it is questioned. There was a time when the systems of warfare in this region followed patterns that had remained unchanged for generations. They worked, not perfectly, but predictably. And predictability creates comfort. It creates a sense that the structure in place is sufficient, that nothing fundamental needs to change. But that assumption only holds until someone sees what others have stopped noticing. Because the most dangerous weaknesses are not hidden. They are visible, but accepted. Repeated so often that they no longer feel like problems. That is what was happening here. A system that had proven itself over time, but had also become limited by that same success. Because when something works long enough, it stops evolving. And when it stops evolving, it becomes vulnerable. Not immediately, not obviously, but gradually, until someone approaches it differently. Not with more force, but with more clarity. And that clarity leads to a question. What if the problem is not the enemy, but the way the system approaches the enemy? That question changes everything. Because it shifts focus away from strength and toward structure, away from numbers and toward efficiency, away from tradition and toward adaptation. And once that shift happens, the system begins to change. Not all at once, but piece by piece, one idea at a time. A different formation, a different weapon, a different expectation of what discipline means. And at first those changes seem small, even unnecessary, because they do not align with what has always been done. And anything that challenges familiarity is often resisted. But results have a way of overcoming resistance. Because when a new approach begins to work, consistently, decisively, it forces recognition, it forces acceptance, and eventually, it replaces what came before. That is how transformation begins. Not through force, but through effectiveness. And effectiveness, when repeated, creates something powerful. Momentum. Because once a system begins to produce results at a higher level, it accelerates, it expands, it builds confidence. And confidence spreads. Not just within the structure, but beyond it. Because success is visible. It sends a message that this system is different. That it is more than just another variation of what already exists. And that message travels. It reaches other groups, other leaders, other systems, and they begin to react. Some with curiosity, some with caution, some with fear. Because when something new proves itself, it does not just exist alongside what is old. It challenges it. And challenge creates tension, especially when it is sustained. Because one victory can be dismissed, two can be explained, but repeated success forces a deeper realization that this is not temporary, that this is not accidental, that something fundamental has changed. And once that realization sets in, the environment begins to shift. Because now, the system is not just operating within a stable structure. It is influencing that structure. It is reshaping expectations, redefining what strength looks like. And in doing so, it begins to accumulate something beyond power. It begins to accumulate influence. And influence is where things become more complex. Because power can be measured. It can be seen. It can be challenged directly. But influence moves differently. It spreads through perception, through reputation, through the way others begin to anticipate your actions. And when influence grows, it changes the behavior of everything around it, sometimes without direct action. Because once a system becomes known for effectiveness, others begin to adjust before confrontation even happens. They become cautious, defensive, reactive. And that gives the system even more control, not just over outcomes, but over expectations. And when expectations shift in your favor, You are no longer just responding to the environment, you are shaping it. That is the peak of strategic power. But it is also the point where a different kind of pressure begins to build. Because influence does not just affect those outside the system, it affects those within it. And that is where things begin to change. Slowly at first, almost invisibly, because the same structure that creates efficiency also creates rigidity. The same discipline that ensures success also limits flexibility, and the same authority that maintains order reduces the space for variation. At lower levels of power, these trade-offs are manageable. They are contained. But as the system expands, as it becomes more dominant, those trade-offs scale with it, and what was once a strength begins to carry weight. Because maintaining that level of control requires consistency. It requires enforcement. It requires that the system continues to operate exactly as designed. But environments do not remain constant. They shift. They evolve. They introduce new variables. And when a system is built on precision, on strict alignment, even small changes in the environment can create pressure. Not enough to break it immediately, but enough to create tension. And tension over time accumulates, not always visibly, but structurally, because the system begins to face a challenge it was not designed for. Not external opposition, but internal strain. The difficulty of maintaining absolute control across an expanding structure. The challenge of ensuring that every part continues to operate as intended. And the reality that as systems grow, they become harder to adjust. Because change at that level is no longer simple. It affects everything. Every process. Every expectation. Every assumption that the system is built on. And so, instead of adapting quickly, the system begins to hold its position. It relies on what has worked. It reinforces its existing structure. It doubles down on its strengths. And in doing so, it delays the need to change. But delay is not the same as resolution. Because the environment continues to move, it introduces new pressures, new uncertainties, and the gap between the system and its surroundings begins to widen. Not dramatically, but steadily. And that gap is where vulnerability begins. Not because the system is weak, but because it is no longer fully aligned with the reality it operates in. And alignment is what determines effectiveness. Not past success, not reputation, but current relevance. And when relevance begins to shift, even the most powerful systems feel it. Not all at once, but in moments, small disruptions, unexpected outcomes, signals that something is different, something is changing. And at first, those signals are easy to dismiss, because the system still works. It still produces results. It still holds its position. But over time, those signals become more frequent, more difficult to ignore, and eventually, they force a decision, adapt, or maintain. And that decision is never simple, because adaptation requires risk. It requires questioning the very structure that created success. It requires letting go of certainty. And certainty is one of the hardest things to release, especially when it has been earned. So the system hesitates, it evaluates, it considers, but it does not move quickly enough. And in that hesitation, the environment continues forward. And that is where the balance shifts, not because of a single failure, but because of timing. Because in moments of transformation, timing is everything. Act too early, and you risk unnecessary change. Act too late, and change becomes forced. And forced change is always more difficult, more disruptive, more costly. That is where this system finds itself. At the edge of a transition it did not fully anticipate, facing pressures it was not designed to absorb, and operating with a structure that, while powerful, is no longer perfectly suited to its environment. This is not collapse. Not yet. This is tension. The kind that builds quietly, that spreads through the system, that affects decisions, that influences behavior, and that, over time, reshapes outcomes. Because once tension reaches a certain point, it begins to express itself, not as a single event, but as a series of adjustments, small changes, reactions, attempts to stabilize, to maintain control, to preserve what has been built. But preservation in a changing environment is not always possible, because what is being preserved may no longer fit. And that is the moment where systems are tested, not in their ability to expand, but in their ability to transform. And transformation is where many systems struggle, because it requires a different kind of strength. Not the strength to dominate, but the strength to change. And that strength is not always present, especially in systems that have been built on consistency, on control, on the repetition of what works, because change introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty challenges identity. It raises questions about what the system is, what it should become, and how it should operate moving forward. And those questions are not easy to answer. Not quickly, not under pressure, not when the system is already under strain. And so, instead of transforming fully, the system begins to fracture. Not visibly, not dramatically, but internally, in the way decisions are made, in the way authority is interpreted, in the way individuals within the system begin to respond. Because once certainty weakens, variation increases, and variation in a tightly controlled system creates instability, and instability over time leads to breakdown, not because of a single failure, but because the structure can no longer sustain itself under changing conditions. And that is how even the most powerful systems reach their limit, not through sudden defeat, but through gradual misalignment, through the accumulation of pressures they were not designed to handle, through the delay of adaptation until it is no longer sufficient, and through the reality that power, no matter how great, does not remove the need to evolve, because evolution is not optional, it is constant. It applies to every system, every structure, every form of power, and those that move with it continue, while those that resist eventually reach a point where continuation is no longer possible. That is the deeper story here, not just of a leader, not just of a system, but of a pattern that repeats across time, across regions, across different forms of power, because the dynamics are the same. The rise, the consolidation, the peak, the pressure, the decision, and the outcome. Different details, different contexts, but the same underlying structure. And understanding that structure is what allows us to see beyond the surface, to recognize that this is not just a moment in history. It is a reflection of how systems operate, how they grow, how they stabilize, and how they eventually face the limits of their design. Because every system has limits, not always visible, not always immediate, but always present. And the challenge is not to eliminate those limits. That is not possible. The challenge is to recognize them early enough, to adapt before they become defining. Because once limits define a system, change becomes reactive. And reactive change is always less effective, less controlled, less sustainable. That is the final lesson. Power is not a fixed state. It is a process, one that requires constant adjustment, constant awareness, constant alignment with reality. And the moment that process slows, the moment awareness fades, the moment alignment weakens, the system begins to move toward its next phase. Not always collapse, but always transformation. And whether that transformation leads to continuation or conclusion depends on how early the system recognizes the need to change. Because in the end, it is not power that determines survival. It is adaptation.